Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is Artnet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news expertly compiled by the Artnet Pro editorial team.
So whatever people's impetus for acquiring art, go ahead, but just know that this may not be resale material if your timing is wrong.
I'm Andrew Russeth, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by Artnet News. The art press is filled with headlines about trophy works trading for huge sums. $195 million for an Andy Warhol, $110 million for a Jean-Michel Basquiat, $91 million for a Jeff Koons. In the popular imagination, pricey art just keeps climbing in value, up, up, up. The truth is more complicated, as those in the industry know. Tastes change and demand shifts. The reputations of artists rise and fall, as do their prices. Reselling art for profit is often quite difficult. It's the exception rather than the norm. This is the art market's dirty secret, Artnet senior reporter Katya wrote last month in her weekly Art Detective column. In her recent columns, Katya has been reporting on that very thorny topic, which is growing even thornier amid what appears to be a severe market correction. As one collector told her, quote, "There's a bit of a carnage in the market at the moment. Many things are not selling at all or selling for a fraction of what they used to." For instance, a painting by Dan Colin that was purchased fresh from a gallery a decade ago for probably around $450,000 went for only about $15,000 at auction recently. And Colin is not the only once-hot figure floundering. As Katya wrote, right now you can often find a painting, a drawing, or a sculpture at auction for a fraction of what it would cost at a gallery. Still, art dealers keep asking and buyers keep paying steep prices for new works. In the parlance of the art world, primary prices are outstripping secondary ones. Why is this happening? And why do seemingly sophisticated collectors continue to pay immense sums for art from galleries, knowing full well that they may never recoup their investment? I'm thrilled to have Katya with us to make sense of these questions and to cover a whole lot more. Hi, Katya. Welcome back to The Art Angle. Thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
So, Katya, to jump into it, can you tell us quickly about your series of recent columns and how you landed on this topic of the primary-secondary divide and the crisis in the market right now?
You know, the idea has been in my head for at least 10 years, but I really dismissed it for a very long time. About 10 years ago, I was at Bloomberg and I was working with a wonderful editor who was one of the earliest to embrace coverage of the art market at the Wall Street Journal. He was at Bloomberg and we did a series of articles then. One of them looked at the unprecedented flipping activity around zombie formalism, and I broke that story that became a huge narrative in the subsequent decade. But as I was writing this article, my editor said, well, you know, the biggest really story you need to follow is the lack of liquidity in the art market and the difficulty of resale. And I thought to myself, I don't know, that doesn't make sense. Everything I've been writing about suggested that art was a great investment, or maybe not every day, but I focused on things that appreciated in value, that went up 17,000% from the moment they were bought until the moment they were sold. The Basquiat, the Warhol, like everything you just mentioned. There are so many young artists who suddenly became almost investment vehicles for speculators. And I didn't understand at the time what he meant and how necessarily I could prove it. It seemed like an insurmountable task.
Totally. Well, you've now done it in a sort of very concise way, an illuminating way in these articles. And maybe that's a segue for you to kind of talk about how the reporting went about, because it sounds like, from reading the columns, people will see you highlighted a few really interesting examples and one collection as well, where this has become a kind of object lesson or case study in what's taking place.
Right. So, you always sort of follow the money. And the first column, and we worked on it together, Andrew. You were my editor on all of these stories. And I'm very grateful to help me shape them because it was such a big topic. And as I started looking at it, I realized that I cannot do one column about all of it because it's really a complex of issues, each of which seem necessary to be explored. That the first column was almost like an introduction. And at that time, so that was mid-March, and it's a very slow time in the market, kind of these low-key, not glamorous auctions are starting to happen. And Christie's, Sotheby's, Phillips, they all had these, like, not even mid-season auctions. Some of them were very small online sales that are very easy to not notice. But I started hearing for the past year quite intensely from buyers of art complaints that secondary prices now lower than primary prices. That prices basically for new works by hot contemporary artists are so high that they exceed what they could be sold for at auction. And that made me think of that story that my editor 10 years ago asked me to pursue. And so finally I was like, you know what, I got to look at it. I got to look at these numbers. And like I said, they weren't glamorous sales. So I was like, okay, let's look at the recent sales, like just random latest sales that were happening.
Yeah.
And I looked at them on my own and I started noticing strange things. The first thing I noticed that jumped out at me was a Frank Stella sculpture from the 80s that was being offered without a reserve, with an estimate of, I think, $150,000 to $250,000, but the starting bid was like $25,000.
Amazing.
That seemed weird. So I kind of filed it away and went on vacation. And then I came back from vacation and the sale was completed. And I went through the results and I noticed that sculpture, a monumental sculpture, sold for $48,000.
Right. And this is astonishing. Frank Stella, of course, better known as a painter, but one of the hallmark artists of the post-war era. And this is a remarkable result.
It's a remarkable result. Someone got incredibly lucky to buy it. But at the same time, I knew that Frank Stella's new works just opened at Jeffrey Deitch's gallery in Soho, where they were being sold for $2.5 million. So obviously, these are radically different works created 40 years apart. So in a way, okay, you can say those are not comparing apples to apples. But the idea that primary prices for the new sculptures by Stella are $2.5 million, but his old works are sold without a reserve for $48,000. To me, that encapsulated the issue.
Yes.
And so then I went back to those auctions and I found a whole bunch of other examples. One of them was the painting by Dan Collin that you mentioned earlier. And I kind of remembered that painting from years ago. And I Googled it and found a reference to that painting in the collection of Rosa and Carlos de la Cruz in Miami. De la Cruz collection was, I think for us and for our generation of reporters and collectors, was something that we, or at least me, I can just talk about myself, it's some place where I looked forward to seeing every year when I went to Miami for Art Basel. They were so on trend, and you always saw the works by the most coveted artists, the hottest artists of that year.
Yes.
Acquired and exhibited beautifully in that 30,000 square foot Kunsthalle.
Everyone went there. It was a place where we all would wander in before the fair, after the fair, the day before, later in the week. And yeah, you would see Guyton, it was wool, it was a great collection of Latin American artists as well. Ana Mendieta, Felix Nogales-Torres.
Dana Schutz.
Yes, exactly.
Dan Collin.
Love it or hate it, it was exciting to be there because you saw the latest works by the most important, hottest artists. It was the place to be. And it felt, I would say, especially as a young writer about art, it felt like a glamorous place to be, too, that this was someone who had access to the best, who had access to what was really exciting and was spending the money to bring all of this into one collection.
Exactly. And I think for collectors who came to shop in Miami, it was a cue what to buy. And they went to the fair and bought works by the same artists.
Yes.
Right? It was a seal of approval.
Yes.
So go back to that painting by Dan Cullen. I looked at the estimate and it surprised me because the estimate was $15,000 to $25,000. And when you're looking at something online, you can't really tell how big or small it is. And then, I looked up the images and it was a massive painting, huge painting. So I just knew that there was no way that this new painting cost them $15,000, $20,000 at that time. And I looked into it and confirmed that, in fact, these paintings, when they were new, they were priced at $450,000. The De La Cruzes bought at least 2 of them, I think 3, and they've sold all of them since then. And they sold all of them for a lot less. And that led me to question why. Why would collectors like the De La Cruzes sell a work that was prominently featured in their collection over the years at a mid-season online sale anonymously? And there was no indication that it was theirs. That led me to a pretty big scoop. I don't know. I get excited by news and I get excited by following the money. And I know it's a complicated story, I think, right now. We're in a complicated moment in the market because there is an unraveling happening. And this collection that was assembled with great care over 2 decades is now going to an auction.
Yes. I think it really does serve as this perfect encapsulation of what you're describing. I mean, this was Katya's sort of the second column in this series, but almost a kind of sidebar of a column. And it was titled, "It Was Her Life, Major Miami Collection Heads to Auction Following Founder's Death." And it will now be sold by Christie's, right? It's estimated to pull in about $30 million, which, as you reported, talking to sources in the field, is really a fraction of what it once could have been acquired for or sold for.
Correct. And that kind of brings us to the kind of important point that so much in the art market is about timing.
Yes.
So if the De La Cruz collection, for whatever reason, was sold 10 years ago, 7 years ago, they could have reaped, more than $100 million in profit. And at this point, the markets of several key artists in the collection have turned. It doesn't mean that they're not important artists in the scheme of things, but tastes have changed since the De La Cruzes acquired them. And the market is very nervous about how they're going to perform. Because already the markets of these artists have contracted in the last few years. And it would be interesting to see whether, first of all, how Christie's estimates them, how attractive and conservative the estimates are. And if they are very conservative, whether they will attract maybe a new generation of collectors interested in these artists and perhaps seeing their revised estimates as an opportunity to buy. So, that would be a really big test.
Right. It's an interesting question of whether the demand will be there. And it could, in a way, be positive over the long term, because we could see people enter the market, stand behind these artists, boost them up. But it's a real risk in selling right now. And you reported that the De La Cruz family essentially has said it's part of their estate planning, to go back to your column. And they saw this as really Rosa De La Cruz's passion. And she has sadly passed away. And so they're making the decision to sell off these works. But as you point out, it's a larger phenomenon, right? The shrinking market. And essentially, what is your sense of why other collectors are willing to take these losses? You have a whole run of people in your column who either are selling for just enormously or much smaller amounts or attempting to sell things and actually failing to even find buyers. Why are people not just sitting on their hands or trying to wait this out?
Many different reasons, of course. In many cases, it's very individual. Of course, there's death, and divorce.
Yeah.
So there are circumstances that bring these works to auction. A lot of them are anonymous, so we don't really know exactly who is selling for what reason. The De La Cruz, there was death. I think people need money.
Mm-hmm.
There might be liquidity issues. Maybe people are harvesting losses. Maybe they made money in another area and selling, okay, it's not going to go up. Let's sell it. Let's not forget also that art costs a lot to own. You have to insure it. You have to store it. Storage is expensive. So I think people are just making these calculations, and perhaps they're sold something incredibly well and made money on another artwork, and that's okay. And that's how I think a lot of advisors counsel their clients. And it was very striking. One advisor that I talked to compared artwork to a new car, and that loses its value when it drives off the lot.
Yeah.
It loses 85% of value. And the person said that if you were lucky over a period of many, many years and possibly decades, maybe a couple of works that you've bought will go up in value so dramatically that they will pay for the entire collection. But most of the works will not be worth more. So again, that issue of liquidity.
Yes.
It's hard to resell art, much harder than maybe the perpetuated narrative.
Yeah. I think this leads us into this larger question. I mean, your columns have generated a fair amount of debate online, people wondering just how deep the crisis runs. To be clear, and you've written this, it's not everyone. It's not every segment of the market, but it is this sort of generational, it's certain groups of artists, and it has to do with the sort of churn we're seeing in names coming in and coming out. And so can you kind of provide some context for us in terms of the argument you're making about what you see looking at the results?
Sure. For me, looking at this from the perspective of liquidity crunch is something new. It clearly existed in the market all these years, but something that I haven't explored. And I know that my colleagues and peers in other publications haven't explored either, just because it's difficult. It requires a lot of digging and comparing prices for works that sold a long time ago. And a lot of them are primary and they're not available. And, it's a pain in the ass, to be honest.
Right.
So so I focused on that because I think it's an important narrative that has to be addressed. It doesn't mean that the market is forever doomed, or people are going to stop buying art,
right,
or people will stop falling in love with artists and painting and sculptures, or feel challenged by them and want to acquire them. It's not going to mean that there's no desire. It's a completely different argument, really. There are a whole bunch of people in the art world who support emerging artists and established artists and at every level, and they buy not as an investment and with no real eye for resale. However, because primary prices have become so high, you cannot ignore the fact that it is an investment because it costs so bloody much.
Yes, more than a house in most states.
More than a house, more than a car, more than anything, And so you can't exactly disregard that aspect. I think it's just irresponsible.
Yeah.
So whatever people's impetus for acquiring art, go ahead, but just know that this may not be resale material if your timing is wrong, or it may be amazing.
Yeah. Don't put your child's college education into the painting from the blue chip Chelsea gallery, because you're not going to be able to claw it back. But this brings up your most recent column, which is titled, "If It Goes to Zero, Fine. Why Do Collectors Keep Paying These Wild Prices?" And I was so happy you took this on, and it was so fun to edit this one, because it's one of these things that we all, as you said, we kind of understand in the art world. Like, to some degree, yes, like this is not a great investment. But rarely do people stop to ask, like, okay, well, then why are people doing it? Without asking you to completely summarize your column, I mean, what were the big takeaways for you as you reported this out in terms of how you convince people to keep doing this and paying these prices?
Well, a lot of collectors, again, here we're talking about very broad strokes. There are obviously many different markets, many different price points. I think people who buy very emerging art, there has been a trend of speculative trading. And I think a lot of people at that level are motivated by just flipping stuff.
Yes.
And just by financial gain. So when prices for emerging artists go up a lot, in some ways it wipes out those gains, right? The delta, the arbitrage goes away. So, of course, they're not happy when prices go up. There are also very established collectors who may have started acquiring works by an artist really early on, when they were with a small gallery and they cost very little. And then the artist, the auction market might have exploded, and then they may have switched to a bigger gallery and then a bigger gallery, and then maybe they're now at Gagosian or Hauser & Wirth, and their primary prices are close to $1 million, and their secondary prices are even more. And so for these collectors, who a lot of them are incredibly wealthy, it's almost like they see the justification, right? They see that they've been right. They guessed it right. And they are very excited by the chase, by the risk, and that the bet paid off. And so when prices for that artist double or triple on the primary market at this mega gallery, they don't mind paying that. Even though that may be a brand new series of works, they haven't received any critical support. They're basically paying record price for the artist at the time, but they're excited because everything that they know, all of their kind of senses are activated, and they already know that the artist has done really well.
Yes.
And there is comfort there. So, there could be that situation. And then, which for me was, I guess, really intriguing also, is that there's a group of people, very large, and probably I would say that a lot of new buyers, I would venture to say that perhaps, are driven by the social cachet of being in the art world. And so for them to pay $200,000, $300,000 to buy a work of art from one of the mega galleries is really like paying for club membership. It brings them into this very rarefied world where they can socialize with top people from most industries, and they have access, and they are wined and dined, and they get, special treatments, and they go to artist studios, and they have private visits to museums, and it's very seductive.
Yes.
And so the thinking is, okay, so if they lose this money, if the work doesn't increase in value, it wasn't maybe so much about financial investment as a social investment. And that's fine for them because they have the money.
Yeah, it's an experiential buy that they're having.
100%.
It's the thrill of the acquisition, but it's also, yes, the world in which they get to move. And as you pointed in your column, I mean, galleries, dealers have become very astute at cultivating this sort of, you said, pomp and this sort of theater. I mean, with Hauser & Wirth, they have these just immaculate, fun estates on Mallorca and out in the countryside in England with the most luscious restaurants, and there are hotels and clubs. It's a whole universe you're buying into.
And private boats and private planes.
Yeah.
And it's a dream, right? Why wouldn't you pay $200,000 to get access into that?
What's interesting that you've drawn out, and I'm going to go back a little bit to your conversation with Jeffrey Deitch, the amazing dealer who, of course, comes from a real business background, being at Citibank early in his career, and thinking about these things. I know he talked to you about the price of those Stellas, and he was pointing out that, the way he's priced them downtown in the millions of dollars, it's expensive to make these things, and it's expensive to even bring these things into the city and care for them. And so I guess the question I'm getting at is essentially what you've laid out is that people are overpaying for art, that they're not going to get their investment back. This potentially could lead to a crisis. What are the implications of this? Like, why should we care almost that maybe collectors are overpaying or making some poor financial decisions from one perspective? Like, what does it have to do with art writ large?
That's a good question. I think it really has to do with art production and what art gets made and what art gets exhibited and celebrated. I mean, I don't think we should worry about Frank Stella. He's an incredible artist. He is in art history, and the sculptures are very expensive to make, and that's why they cost so much. This week we were at the Talking Galleries conference where you moderated a fascinating panel. I think that it boils down to the art that we see and actually the livelihoods of the artists who make these works. Because while we are on this wave and everything is going up, everything has expanded dramatically in the art world, right? The number of galleries artists show at, the number of branches galleries have, fairs, everything has ballooned, right? There's an overproduction. Artists have studios, they have assistants, and they have private chefs, and they also have families. They send their kids to private schools. Yes. I'm just saying, when their art stops being sold, that's a huge financial hit, just on a basic level. Let's think about that. Also at the Talking Galleries, art advisor Alan Schwartzman, it struck me what he said, that there are now dozens and dozens of artists who have been very successful for many years, mid-career or even beyond mid-career. They've come to rely on being with good galleries, having new exhibitions every few years, selling most of the work in those shows, getting good reviews, getting good museums. And now, according to Alan, they are basically unsellable. There's no market for their works.
Yeah.
What are they supposed to do?
Right.
What's going to happen to them?
Right.
Just on a human level. But then how do galleries deal with that? I think traditionally, my understanding is that galleries, you can't stop supporting an artist just because fashions change. So they focus on something else, on another artist. And that's where this churn comes in, right? So there's a newer artist, a more fashionable artist, who is making the work that everyone wants. And then that other artist gets kind of sidelined. I don't know, maybe galleries hope that they're going to switch galleries. They go somewhere else and that will be somebody else's problem. I spoke with Marian Boski this week, and she said that being an artist is like a roller coaster. You could be the most successful artist on the planet today and be kind of forgotten 3 years later.
Yes.
She said some artists freeze when their demand for their works goes down and they can't work, they can't produce, they're just frozen. Some artists keep going to their studio, keep making the work. And, I would imagine that responsible galleries who are there for the long run would stay with these artists and find a way to show them. But the pendulum may swing back or it may not. It's really a lot of risk. And I think that that's why maybe we care about this, because ultimately they're human beings who it affects. And then another point that was made at the conference, which I agree with, and I thought it was fair, that the art that is being championed right now, or has been since the pandemic, it's safer than it has been. And the impact that the fashion has on experimentation, on risk, right? What are we seeing? It has been figurative painting pretty much for the past 4 years.
Yeah.
In the panel that you moderated, it struck me how art dealer Monica Carmansudo from Carmansudo Gallery, she said that they started showing all kinds of art, all kinds of experimental work, video and installations and sculpture, everything. And she said that now they mainly sell paintings.
Yes.
And it really struck me. I don't know how you felt about it.
I was shocked by that because, of course, that's a gallery that I see as so adventurous and has such a history of just bold, risk-taking things. And I think that's what you've got in your column in this interesting way. I mean, there are a lot of different things going on. And one of them is what you've just talked about with Boesky, this incredible speed in which the churn is happening now. You're in, you're out. You have to make all your money, you get out. And I think galleries have adapted to that to a certain degree. But it also means that this has come at a time. This something else that came up is overheads have just grown a lot, right? You need multiple branches. You need to have more staff. You need to do all these incredible things to kind of keep the churn going, to do all these art fairs. And then the work just becomes so much more conservative.
Exactly.
I do studio visits with artists, and it's come up multiple times that I need to make something for this fair, and it's got to be a painting. Like, there's no time for anything. I heard that from someone I was surprised by. Again, this is like someone who is more adventurous in their practice. And so you see this flight to a certain conservatism. And it's interesting to think about that vis-a-vis what you're talking about with the collectors. Because on the one hand, the collectors know they're going to lose money. And yet even they kind of do gravitate these days, it seems like, toward paintings, towards things that have a little bit more of a financial instrument aspect to them.
In September, I went to the Armory show, and there were so many paintings of flowers, like pretty flowers.
Yeah.
Okay, great, but like,
love
just
them.
booth after booth after booth. They're very nice to look at, but then we're talking about very decorative work, which has its place, but the safety is troubling, I would say.
Yeah.
So I think that's why all of this matters.
Yeah, it affects what we see. It affects how the whole system runs. I mean, Jerry Saltz always says it. I think he's right. The prices for contemporary art, especially young, early career, untested, they're just totally out of whack. And it's happened in the past, I think, 10, 15 years. I mean, I would go to the Lower East Side. You would see a nice sized painting in a first show was $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 not so long ago. Now it's probably 10 times that in many cases. I mean, I'm really generalizing here.
But let's not generalize. Let's be specific.
Yeah.
I was thinking one of the artists that I discussed with Marion Boesky, she has a new exhibition by Danielle McKinney.
Yes.
Who makes this very intimate, very sensual portraits of mostly Black women. And her signature touch is that they have very kind of neon pink nail polish on their fingers, on their toes, that really pops. The paintings are very often very dark. And so this kind of a touch of color really enlivens them. So the artist, she had a photography practice before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, she was, like everyone else, locked in for her house. And she started painting these small canvases. And they really took off. And I remember seeing them in 2021, in the summer of 21, in a bunch of different places. And at that time, the prices were around $20,000 for them. Well, Marion's show in Chelsea, there are 12 works, 10 for sale, and the price range is $60,000 to $90,000. So the size that was 20 3 years ago is now 90.
That's an incredible increase.
It's a big increase. And Marion really thought long and hard about how to price them, because as a responsible gallerist, she needs to price them on the one hand in a way that makes it still appealing and affordable for museums, where she would love these paintings to go. On the other hand, there's a secondary market. It's not insane yet. There have been only 2 paintings at auction. One sold for $200,000, one sold for $100,000. So her new primary pricing kind of takes into account those secondary resales, right? Because she doesn't want also to invite people to speculate,
right,
which inevitably happens at every level. I don't care how major the collector is, they all speculate.
Yeah.
Because at some point, they can sell one work and buy 20 others.
Right.
It's not like they take the money and go out for dinner. They put it usually back into their collecting.
I mean, that's a great outcome for everyone involved. Reinvest the profits. Come on, everyone wins.
Everyone wins. But the issue is, and I wish Danielle McKinney a long career until she's 100 years old of success. Hopefully that's what happens. But we've seen again and again these very rapid price spikes and then plateaus.
Yes. You have to keep finding
and
people.
And that's the danger, because you have to find people. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last month and asking people about. And it was really fascinating to see that this radical for the art market issue of, is there a point at which it is a responsible thing to do to cut prices?
Fascinating question. I'm so glad that you're diving into this. I mean, what can you kind of preview of your reporting around this?
Well, what's fascinating is that this used to be a taboo, and there is a huge divide. On your panel, again, I'm going back to talking galleries, one dealer, Jasmine Tsu from former JTT, which she had to close, said that you can't cut prices because collectors are very attached to those numbers. It was very funny. She said, in the art market, somehow the value equals quality. She said, you can book a hotel room today and it will be one price, and then you can book it tomorrow and it will be another price. The room doesn't change the value. You know what you get for that price.
Yeah.
But it's not the same in the art world. The same thinking wasn't applied. And I remember how years ago I got in trouble with Gagosian because I went to a Sugimoto exhibition, I think maybe in 2009.
Uh-huh.
I asked about prices, and somehow I found out that they were giving like 25% discounts. And in my column, I reported the new price at a 25% discount. Anyway, they got so angry at me. They argued that the new price is a discounted price. It's not a new price. But if you go to Bloomingdale's and buy a skirt at a 20% discount, you're not saying it's $200 minus 20%. Right. You're just saying it's like $160.
Right.
So I applied that thinking to Sugimoto, and it was a big mess. But, it's interesting that I think that people are starting to think about it, perhaps because so many artists are now in trouble. Mm-hmm. This week, I talked to more dealers about it. So Alan Schwartzman thinks, cut the prices.
Yeah.
And let the new prices find new buyers.
Yes.
And then you can rise with that new group of buyers, perhaps beyond where you were.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's stagnation and nothing happens. It was interesting. Elizabeth D., the co-founder of the Independent Art Fair, raised that question at one panel. And I talked to several dealers subsequently. It was interesting. So they said that in principle, they don't mind necessarily cutting prices, but they have to obviously get the blessing from the artist, and they have to somehow also explain it to the collectors who already own the works, that it's not a disaster, but it's actually a smart thing to do. But they also said that maybe they don't necessarily need to cut prices, because what they can do is encourage an artist to do just a very different body of work. Maybe not do like 6-foot wide paintings, maybe do like small paintings, or maybe focus on a group of work, or maybe drawings, or maybe prints, things that are not as expensive. Maybe experiment with things that they always wanted to do and couldn't because of that churn, and they were in the kind of a glare of the market, and they did have to produce relentlessly for a number of years. Maybe there was something else they want to do. So it's not necessarily like apples to apples. I thought it was an interesting solution. And given this kind of idea, as I walked Chelsea right after the conference ended, I did notice quite a few galleries, very blue chip galleries, showing very small paintings.
Wow. I love this. Well, that's a tip that everyone should look out for as they wander around. Look for the smaller or the off-brand or slight variant. But both of those solutions just strike me as really exciting. I mean, of course, there's a certain sadness in having to do that, cut a price or pursue something else. But I think just as an art viewer and an art lover, as I know you and I both are, it's really sad when you see an artist you love go from that every 2-year show to every 3-year, and you kind of know the market's getting quiet, and suddenly they sort of disappear. They might appear on the roster still on the website, they may not, and suddenly we don't see much of them. Whereas, let's create opportunities, if they're a great artist, to keep them in the mix and keep supporting their practice and letting us all see it, rather than necessarily having to churn and kind of drop people, essentially. So it's an interesting moment. Start of a new era, maybe.
Start of a new era. But at the same time, I can see how it's very disconcerting for a lot of market players, because there is a very real possibility right now that many artists will be caught in that downward spiral that some people call death spiral. But I don't want to be like totally doom and gloom. But it must be a very frightening moment because for artists, but also for the galleries, because we've already seen a lot of galleries close their doors and some very important voices extinguished. And again, it's really unfortunate. And galleries do have huge overheads. Traditionally, I think people thought about the gallery that needs to withstand keeping the doors open and operating for 2 years with no sales, to have enough capital to do that. But, the slowdown started kind of around Art Basel in 2022. So we are coming on the 2-year mark. And that's what worries me a lot.
It's a leaner moment, maybe.
Yes. And auctions are coming up in May. And so far, we've seen what some people described as a very worrisome contraction for a lot of artists who were just until recently in high demand. I focused in my first column about this on the sales in early March. Since then, there have been auctions in Hong Kong. Actually, Art News came out with a newsletter connecting a bunch of dots, and it's not a great trend, but there were withdrawals of works by, let's say, Nicholas Party, who seemed like bulletproof.
Red hot, many collectors, hungry for this
Absolutely.
work.
So his work was withdrawn, which usually happens when there is no interest. A work by Cause got withdrawn, and then Avery Singer, Nicole Eisenman, Nijadeka Crosby went unsold. Jamie and Giuliano Villani, who has a big first show at Gagosian right now in Chelsea with works, I think, priced between $50,000 and like $200,000, sold for the equivalent of just below $18,000. And that work, Art News says, was acquired for $118,000 in 2020. So it's like 85% decline. So it's, again, like very bad optics, I would say.
It's a tense, uncertain moment. And as you reported, come May, we'll get to see the De La Cruz work up. We have Basel not too long after that. So it's a tricky moment. And it is interesting that I'm so glad you've been able to go behind the scenes to capture the discussions taking place in galleries about how we can meet the moment, how artists can meet the moment and get through it. But for right now, everyone should go to Chelsea, and I'm excited to go to Chelsea and get a look at these shows where this might be taking place, what you described with the smaller works and the slightly different strategies going on. Is there anything you want to kind of add in closing as you get back to working on the next series in the column?
What I would like to add, perhaps, is that it's been really interesting to look into these issues, this complicated, very charged issues of the moment, through, I think, the prism of liquidity. And, another sort of where my mind goes and what I would like to explore down the line is the impact of private foundations on the ecosystem and how it led to this perhaps an unsustainable velocity. And of course, I think we really need to examine the overproduction by artists. That's another key metric, I would say, that landed us all in this moment.
Yes, having to produce this just stream of work to get it into art fairs, to get into branches around the world. And I think so that's something for people to look forward to as you do your future columns, is looking at this, how different players are thinking about it. You've kind of done it from the collective's perspective. You're doing it from the galleries, the art dealers' perspective right now. And then also looking at for artists who, of course, have these incredible tensions, like make the money while they can versus try to be sustainable over the long term. And we're really in uncharted territory, it feels like, because the art world has gotten so big, has gotten so top-heavy in some ways. And you're in the trenches, in the back rooms, talking to all the players involved. And it's been a thrill for me to edit it and to chat with you now. Thanks so much for being on the show, Katya. I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It'll help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Carolyn Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.